I'm going to be doing a demo to show you 3 different techniques: blending, scumbling, and impasto. We're going to learn how to do these techniques, when to do these techniques. Then you will all practice them. We'll also use this sheet to paint on, but also to write on and use as a study guide. Okay. All right, so just so you know how I set up my paper here, I mixed up 2 values from my value scale that are next to each other. So a light and a mid-tone. I did it again here. Here I made it a little darker than you should, just so that the technique shows up on the camera a little bit better. And then you can put any value you want here. Okay, so these try and be close together, maybe even a little closer than I have them. It'll be easier for you. Again, I just made them a little bit more contrast here, so it'll show up on camera. Okay, so the first technique we're going to do is called blending, right? And you've probably heard of this one before. And blending, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a transition between 2 colors. Now we have 2 of the same hue here, just different values. So we'll be making a value transition. But if this was, say, yellow and this was blue, we could also do a transition in hue or saturation. So any kind of color transition is what it's good for. Because right now we don't have a transition. We have 2 planar shapes of value, 2 flat shapes of light and a little bit darker, right? With a clear division between the 2. And all of your paintings have shapes of different values right now. And within your objects, you're going to want to soften this edge. And there's different ways to create that color transition. And one of them is through blending. Another thing that you can use blending for is if you don't want a full gradation between the 2, but say this is a cast shadow and this is your tabletop and you want to soften the edge here, you can also do just a little bit of blending just to create a blurred edge between here, right? So we call that a soft edge. So we can use it for color transitions and soft edges. Now, we're going to use a brush we haven't used before. I believe the one in your kit has a blue handle, but this is a synthetic brush. It's very different than your bristle brushes. It's much softer, so it doesn't push paint around as well. It mushes paint around, right? It blends paint. So what we use this one brush for is for creating color transitions and soft edges through blending. Now, if you were to try and do that, the paint is dry, right, on your paintings right now. So you cannot physically blend these 2. So painting is all about painting and repainting. So don't be afraid to, cover a whole planar shape of value again, right? So you mix up your values and re-wet these as close as you can, right? So this is my darker value here. Wipe my brush. I grab my lighter value. All right, so then you re-wet the lighter value, right? It takes time. And then you wipe your brush. It's important to be wiping your brush throughout the blending process. Now that both are wet, right? If I just wanted to create a soft edge, if this was a cast shadow, right? You could blur them by maybe just swiping, right? So now my edge is going to be more blurred, right? So that's now a soft edge rather than it being so hard, okay? But if I want it to be a full transition, I wipe because I don't want to keep applying more paint. I start pulling one value into the next, and then I wipe. And then I try to mix in between all the new divisions that I'm making. If my paint starts to dry, I have to add more paint, or if I'm wiping away too much. So I had more dark paint than I had light, so I need to apply a little bit more light value and then mix here. So what you're trying to do is get rid of any division you see between values. Reason why you wipe is because you don't want to keep applying. So you can get real finicky. Say, I'm like, no, I really want to try this again, right? Just apply my two values again. It's helpful if you change your brush mark. Don't keep going in the same direction. And the idea is to get it so you no longer see a clear division between the two values, right? So it's drying right now. Zoom in. And you can see it's starting to blend. Now, because my paint dries darker, right, I'm going to wait for this to dry to see if that is going to match. If not, I can go back and rework that area, okay? So to review, blending, we're going to use it for both soft edges or full color transitions. And the rules are, the rules to do it is we need a synthetic brush. Synthetic means man-made. Nice soft bristles. Synthetic brush. And it needs to be wet paint on a wet surface. So your brush needs to be wet and the surface needs to be wet as well with paint. Okay? Now, there's multiple ways to create transitions. The next way is going to look really different, and it's called scumbling. So look at the spelling for how to say that, scumbling. Another word for scumbling is dry brush. Okay. So we're going to use this technique to also create color transitions, right? So like a gradation of some sort, transition. Which means if it can create a transition between these two things, it can also soften this edge for us. So we can create soft edges. And then we're going to notice one other thing that it does. Let's see. Now, we cannot do scumbling with a synthetic brush. We have to go back to our bristle brushes, okay? So nice hard hog's hair brush, okay? And it needs to be dry. And it will only work if your surface is completely dry. Now, when you're doing scumbling, you're going to take one value and drag a broken layer over the other. Or you can take the light and drag over the dark. But you want to make sure it's really dry so that you see some of the underneath value poking through the layer that you're doing. So they're not going to physically blend like we did here. They're going to visually blend. From far away, the two values will look like they're mixing together to create an in-between value. So what that looks like, I'm going to take the lighter value and drag it over my darker value. It is dry, so I can do this. It would be blending if it's not. So we're not going to do that. I'm going to grab a little bit on both sides of my brush of my lighter value. Okay, just a little bit. And I'm not going to do it over here yet. I'm going to show you, this is how dry. Look how little paint. You see how you can see white coming through this layer. Right, so if I zoom in, right, you can see white coming through the paint. It is not a flat, opaque paint, but it's also not watery. It's not a wash. It's very dry. The paint is drying on my brush right now, right? So I'm going to grab a little bit like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, since I have the light value, I'm going to start on my light side and start dragging the paint over the dark side. I'm going to kind of scrub it, right? But that's not a nice transition. We don't want to see this line anymore. So I'm going to kind of do it a lot more over here until I get that line covered. Maybe I'll grab a little bit more paint. A little bit more paint over here to cover the line, and then keep dragging it over. You have a little less control than with blending. And then let the paint run out as I go to this side. Right? Would like rub some of the, there we go. Okay. So when I zoom in, go over a little bit. Right? So you can see it's starting to create this texture, maybe a little too much. So that's the one thing that Scumbling does that blending did not. Blending had no texture, looks really smooth. Scumbling is much more texture. You can kind of see the weave of the paper or the canvas through it. It's not perfect. Once this is dry, if you didn't get, right, it's a little splotchy here. I'd like a much smoother transition. I can now, if I want, take the darker value and scumble over the light value. So I'm going to see if it's dark. So I'm going to grab a little bit. The reason why it's really noticeable is because I have too big of a difference between these values, but I did want it to show up on the camera. So whenever you're making a value transition, it is important to make sure that your values are pretty close together. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to make a smooth transition between two values that are really different. It's just going to take you longer. And I'll take more space. You'll have to kind of go further in to the other, right? So you can kind of go back and forth, but you do have to wait for the layers to dry so they don't physically mix, which doesn't take long with Scumbling because it's so dry as it is. And now I'm going back over with a little bit more light. You can see it's starting to get less splotchy. Okay. So that's Scumbling. All right, so if we go back to our paper here, I'm going to put my brush in my water now. Right, so Scumbling, you can create color transitions and soft edges, just like blending. But what was different is that you can also create texture, visual texture. Doesn't feel like anything, but it does look rougher. So if you're painting maybe rocks, right, something rough like that, you might use this not just as for creating transitions and soft edges, but maybe you use it to actually create the texture of the actual object that you're painting. Right? So this one does three different things. Remember, you cannot create texture with blending. Blending removes texture, which is why we're using that synthetic brush. Now, what are the rules? Well, this one we need a bristle brush. And instead of wet paint on a wet surface, we want dry on dry. Right? You don't want a wet paintbrush. You don't want a wet surface. Now, the last technique we're going to talk about is really different. It has nothing to do with creating color transitions, and it's called impasto. Impasto in Italian means thick paste. All right, so we're going to use really, really thick paint. Now, there's no specific type of brush. I like to use my bristle brushes. You could try a palette knife, right? I have a palette knife here to try and get a really different kind of look. I'm just going to use my bristle brush. I'm going to take my water off of it. And really all impasto is thick paint. So you can use it with anything, right? But it's so thick that you have a side light on it, creates a cast shadow, right? Really thick paint. Now, where would you do this? Well, if you look at an old master painting like Rembrandt, portraits, they're very realistic looking. He would use impasto on his highlights, but you wouldn't do it like this thick on this thin, right? You build up. So as he gets lighter, he gets thicker and thicker paint till he gets to his bright white highlights, and then he'll do it really, really thick on top. But it is on thicker and thicker paint, so it doesn't stand out as much, but it does stand out. Why? Think about that how to create a focal point handout that's in your packet. Texture contrast, right? It's going to grab our attention. So that is one reason we would use it to create emphasis. So on our focal points or secondary focal points. So you can, as you get lighter and lighter on your objects, you can get thicker and thicker. And then on your bright white highlight or almost white highlight, you could use impasto for emphasis. Another thing you could use it for is texture, but this texture is very different than scumbling, right? Scumbling is visual texture, meaning it looks like texture, but it doesn't feel like texture. Actual texture, if once this dries, I could run my finger on it and it'll feel like what it looks like, right? And then the last thing that it would do is it would create a hard edge. So if you want an edge to be really noticeable and not be soft, really a difference between this edge, and draw attention to it, you could use impasto, right? So these are 3 painting techniques that you're going to now apply. Well, right now you're going to practice it. But then after class, you'll go back into your paintings, and I want to see everyone try to use blending to create color transitions and soft edges, to try and use scumbling for other color transitions and soft edges, but perhaps to create a little bit more texture variation in your painting. And then on those focal points, secondary focal points and primary focal points, try your impasto on those bright highlights, but don't forget to gradually work up to it.